Hi, and welcome back. Would you believe it's been 20 years since FabFilter released their first plugin? So in celebration, here's 20 tips and tricks that you might not have thought to try. Here's a guitar part. I wanted it to be bendy and wobbly, but unfortunately all my guitars are hardtails, apart from my Strat, which is set up as a hardtail. So I played it on my Epiphone Wilshire and did my best with bending the neck. No problem. I can add more vibrato with Volcano 3. Let's add an XLFO. Vibrato usually sits somewhere around the 5 Hz mark, and I'll link it to the delay parameter for this filter, which incidentally is a shelving band set flat, so it's not doing anything else. The modulation depth needs to be pretty subtle, and I'll also need to turn up the delay knob a little so that the modulation oscillates from 0 to just a little bit. Okay, this works, but needs a little refinement. First of all, good players usually play vibrato at some subdivision of the song tempo. Shout out to Adam Neely for making me consciously aware of that. 8th notes feel right in this case. And of course, I need a good way to bring this in and out, because full on all the time is a bit much. I could automate this modulation depth parameter, but this would be awkward as the values are so small. So let's add a slider instead. I'll set the modulation depth to 0, then drag from the slider to link that, and set this secondary modulation depth about where the first one was. Now I can use the slider to add vibrato when I want it, and I can automate the full range of this parameter, which is much more convenient. Another issue, however, with the slider all the way down, we have no delay modulation, but we still have a bit of delay because we had to turn the delay knob up a bit. I could turn this knob down and then link the slider to that as well, but there's a more elegant solution. If I drag the first step of the XLFO, I can change its value, and I can use the knob that appears to the right to quickly set it to 0. Now the LFO is unipolar and positive only, so we don't need to turn up the delay parameter when we add vibrato. It can stay at 0, and the LFO will modulate from 0 to just a little bit. Of course, this change has also halved the modulation depth, so I'll compensate by increasing that a little. Unipolar LFOs can be useful in lots of different contexts, modulating pulse width or oscillator sync in Twin 3, for example. Or you can use negative-only LFOs or sequences to modulate gain parameters without having to then compensate for the gain boost in the positive cycles. Okay, let's stick with Volcano. Here's a static all-pass filter, which you might expect to be transparent, with no modulation or parallel routing. Except it's using the tube style, so it's not transparent. It still adds harmonics in interesting ways. This one is processing the guitar melody part before the amp, much like an overdrive pedal. Listen to the difference when I toggle bypass. All the different filter styles have their own different flavour and add different patterns of harmonics, as we can see from these Hammerstein graphs from Plugin Doctor. Except the clean style, which doesn't add harmonics and only shifts the phase. Of course, this will still change the shape of the wave, so it might change the way it hits downstream distortion or saturation stages anyway. Okay, here's a clean all-pass filter. This is transparent, right? You can't hear the difference when I toggle bypass. It's still transparent if I modulate it. Unless I modulate it really fast. But that's a different tip. What I'm actually going to do is pop open the output panel and set a 50-50 dry-wet mix. And it's now a notch filter. This vertical line on the phase response represents 180 degrees of phase shift, so that frequency cancels perfectly with the dry signal to create a notch. Why not just use a notch filter, you might ask? The answer lies in what happens when I increase the filter slope parameter. Now the signal rotates through 180 degrees multiple times, and we get a notch for each one. With the modulation back on, we get a classic phaser effect. If I tweak the ring around the cutoff knob, I can offset the left and right channels slightly and create some stereo width. Okay, let's switch to Saturn. You're probably all familiar with the one knob compression that you get when you turn up the dynamics knob. It's highly program dependent and tends to work well on most sources. Let's save that setting in memory B, then reset it back to 0. There is another way to get compression out of this plugin, however. Let's have an envelope follower, link it to the level knob with negative modulation, then turn up that knob to add makeup gain, with the modulation depth serving like a ratio control. This compression, I think you'll agree, sounds utterly unlike the dynamics knob compression I saved in memory B. Worlds apart, right? And this more manual compressor setup can also be tweaked more with the envelope follower's attack and release parameters. We've not finished yet, however. Let's reset the level knob and disable the modulation. And why not link the envelope follower to the dynamics knob instead? What on earth are we doing here? There are 3 ways to think of it. 1, we're only compressing the loud bits. 2, we've created an interestingly soft and gradual knee for the one knob dynamics, and also added sort of attack and release controls. Or 3, who cares, it sounds cool. We still haven't finished with compression, however. Here's a setup with 3 separate bands. Each of these gets its own independent dynamics knob, so you can create quick and easy multiband compression if you want. But you can also, if you want, still set up the manual or complex compression tricks I just showed you in multiband mode. If I click the source button in this envelope follower module, we see that, as well as the usual main and sidechain input options, we now have a choice of each band as well, so we can drive the envelope follower from the outputs of the crossover filters. If I choose band 1, then link the envelope follower to the low band dynamics knob, I've now set up that complex compression for just the low frequencies. And if I add 2 more envelope followers and set those to key from the mid and high bands, I can create a full, proper multiband version of this effect. Okay, here's Twin 3 with a noise oscillator running through a very resonant filter. This makes a great basis for a pad sound. But of course, we need the filter to track the keyboard and essentially act as an oscillator. So let's add a key tracking modulator, drag a link to the filter node, and set the depth all the way up. We now have perfect key tracking, but that's only half the story. You probably also want it tuned to concert pitch. I find it easiest to add a sine wave oscillator as a tuning reference. And bonus tip, if you max out the hold time for the amp envelope, you won't have to keep holding down a key on your MIDI keyboard while tuning the filter. Remember, you can hold Shift to fine-tune the filter cutoff. And note that the different filter styles can vary very slightly in their tuning, so you might need to tweak it again if you change styles. Once the filter is in tune, you can turn off the sine wave and dial back the hold for the main envelope if you did that, and can play nice breathy sounding chords just like any other patch. This kind of sound often works well in stereo. There's an easy way to do that. If I switch to 2 unison voices, this has done 2 things. We've now got separate, uncorrelated noise for the left and right channels, and we've also slightly offset the filter cutoffs for each channel so they're slightly detuned. I like the first one of those, but not the second. Fortunately, there are 2 very easy ways to fix it. I can turn down the unison parameter to remove the detuning, while retaining the 2 independent noise sources. Or I can switch back to just one voice, and instead add another noise oscillator, match the gain of the first, and pan them hard left and right. Either way, we get a different, uncorrelated noise for each channel, processed through an identical filter tuned the same. Lovely. Okay, so I decided I want each note to sweep up in pitch at the start. That's easy, right? I'll add an envelope. I'll start dragging a connection to the main pitch parameter, before remembering that the filter is the oscillator in this patch, then drag it there instead. Let's have negative modulation, and set up the envelope with 0 sustain. Okay, that was easy. So what if I now decide that I want the notes to sweep back down again during the release stage? It's not so obvious how to achieve that. But it's easy when you know how. I'll click this little button on the envelope modulator and switch it to neutral sustain mode. If I now drag the sustain parameter up, you'll notice the 0 line comes with it. This envelope is now bipolar. Anything above the sustain level is positive modulation, and anything below it is negative. At least it will be when I flip the modulation back to positive. So to achieve the sweep up and down at the start and the end, I can set the sustain all the way up, then set the attack and release times accordingly. Job done. Alright, let's take this patch further. I've added another filter running a colourful peaking boost, which I'm modulating with a sine wave LFO, which in turn has its frequency modulated by a triangle wave LFO. That's not the tip, though. What I want to point out is the upper limit for the XLFO frequency. 500 Hz is fast in LFO terms, but not really in audio rate oscillator terms. But what if I add 2 more steps to the pattern and create a double sine wave? That maximum 500 Hz setting will now actually give us 1 kHz. With 2 more steps, the maximum increases to 1K5. With the maximum 16 steps, we can get LFO rates right up to 4 kHz. Note, you might find the high quality option at the bottom makes a big difference when you're doing this kind of stuff. Ironically, having reduced the aliasing with high quality mode, I'm now going to deliberately add some with the destroy mode distortion in Saturn. And I'll call back to an earlier tip with a negative only step sequencer modulating the master output volume knob. I've gone with a 12-step sequence to match the compound time triplet feel I have going on, but you could also use 8 or 16 steps if you prefer. We can't switch patterns with these sequences, but we can do something similar. If I drag the phase offset for the sequence, I can make it start on a different step. So let's reset the phase to 0, and I'll load another XLFO with a 4-step sequencer preset, synced to 4 bars, and use that to modulate the phase. Important tip, don't change the modulation depth. You might expect to need it all the way up to modulate the full range of the sequence, but in fact this gives over-modulation of the phase. The default modulation depth is exactly what we want in this case. Now I'll tweak the levels for the 4-step sequencer. I'll keep the first step at 0, and set the second step to 0.333, and the third to 0.667. The final one looks like it should be at 1, but that's the same as 0, so I'll go with 0.167. Note that if you're modulating an 8 or 16 step sequence, you'll probably want values like 0.25, 0.5, 0.75 instead. Anyway, the main sequence now starts on a different step every bar, which is certainly more interesting. What if we wanted it more random, however? Let's turn off this phase modulation and load up another XLFO, which I'll set to hard random sample and hold, with a 1-bar sync. And let's try modulating the phase with that to get random patterns. And that's not quite what I want. Most of the time the random modulation starts the pattern partway through a step, so it ends up out of sync. Let's delete that then, and go back to the 4-step sequence. I'll turn the modulation back on, but set the XLFO to run freely and turn down the frequency all the way. Next, I'll use the random LFO to modulate the phase of the 4-step sequence, which now functions as a kind of lookup table. I've defined 4 acceptable phase modulation amounts, which all reset the sequence at the start of a step, and I'm choosing between them with the random LFO. And the result is a random pattern variation for each bar. Of course, step sequences can also be useful for little melodic patterns as well. Here's some stereo pink noise running through a bandpass filter. When I modulate this with a step sequence, it starts to suggest a little melody. But what if I want it to hit specific notes and be in tune? Fine-tuning the step levels by ear could be a frustrating and time-consuming business. So here's the easy method. Set the modulation depth to maximum, then turn on the keyboard scaling for the XLFO pattern. This does 2 things. It restricts the modulation range to just 1 octave up or down, and it quantizes the step values to equal-tempered semitones corresponding to the keyboard graphic on the left. And it's now really easy to dial in the melody you want. What if you want a bit more unpredictability though? Well, why not pick a step and randomize it? Or why not multiple steps? Okay, back to the drums. Let's imagine that you've only got a stereo stem, or you're processing a mixed drum loop, but you want the snare a bit brighter without also boosting the hi-hat and cymbals. Let's load up a Pro MB, add a high band, and dial in some upward expansion. Here's the tip. If I expand the control panel and enable free filter mode, I can tune the sidechain filters for this band independently of the main crossover filters. Let's listen to the sidechain and tune it to the low fundamental of the snare drum. Now the expansion is keyed by the low mid-range where the snare drum dominates, while only affecting the high frequencies. And it's easy to get a few extra dB of high frequency snap on the snare without overly affecting anything else. Bonus tip, low frequencies are slower than high frequencies, kind of by definition. So I find a little bit of look ahead can help you catch the initial transients better. Speaking of low frequencies, here's a synth bass part. It's very mono. Here's an instance of Pro Q3. I'm going to dial in a few hefty cuts and boosts in the mid-range. Between 3 and 5 is generally enough. Then lasso them all and split them into separate left and right bands with a little button on the panel. Then, with the original 4 bands still selected, I'll drag the gain knob the other way and reverse the gains for all 4 bands. And we now have opposite cuts and boosts for the left and right channels. Having set this up, I can now select all 8 bands together and tune them up or down, scale the gains, adjust the Q and so on. This is a great way to add a sense of space and depth without muddying it with reverb. This can even be an alternative to a short, early reflection type setting. And it's almost completely mono-compatible as a bonus. Not 100%, the cuts and boosts won't entirely cancel out in mono, and a little bit of lumpiness will remain. But usually this is fine. It definitely won't cause any drastic mono-compatibility issues. Okay, kick duck bass is a classic trick that you can do with Pro C2 or Pro G, and can be useful when used subtly or to create obvious pumping. When you want it subtle, however, sometimes it's better to only duck the low frequencies of the bass part and leave the mids alone. So bonus 4 tips in 1. Here's how to do that in 4 different FabFilter plugins. I'll start with probably the most obvious candidate, Pro MB. We'll need a low band. I'll give it a hard knee and a high ratio, then switch it to key from the external sidechain input. I've already routed my kick drum here. The method for that will depend on the DAW you're using, so check the manual if you're not sure how to do that. Now I just need to set the threshold so that every kick drum sends the gain hard into the range limit, and set that range limit to control the amount of ducking. And optionally add some makeup gain to boost the low frequencies in between kick drums. You'll need a moderately fast attack time, and a bit of look ahead can't hurt, but there's no need to be super fast, as we're only ducking slow, low frequencies. The release time is more important. Faster settings will bring up the bass more quickly after each kick drum, which will give higher average levels for those frequencies. But if it's set too fast, the low frequencies will start to feel congested, and the whole mix will start to feel slow and cumbersome, like wading through treacle. Sorry for such a vague and subjective description, but it's the best I've got. Sometimes a slower, bouncier release just feels better for the low frequencies, and it's always a feel thing for me. We've got options at the bottom for the type of crossover. Minimum phase means there's a constant static phase shift at the crossover frequency. This is usually inaudible and nothing to worry about, however, and it's nicely light on CPU with 0 latency. Dynamic phase crossovers means no crossovers, at least not in the main signal path. This mode is actually technically dynamic EQ. That means there's variable phase shift, none at all when the band is at unity gain, rising to just a little bit when it's cutting or boosting, just like a normal EQ. This mode uses a little bit more CPU, but is still usefully 0 latency. Linear phase means no phase shift at all, regardless of what the compressor is doing, the price for which is higher CPU use and some latency. Okay, maybe you don't have MB, but you do have Pro Q3. No problem. Let's start with a low shelf, then dial in some compression. I'll switch to the manual compression mode so we get a threshold slider, and switch to the external sidechain. Once again, I've already set up the routing from the kick drum channel. Now I can set the threshold to catch every kick drum, and the dynamic range to set the amount of ducking. And that's basically it. We don't get to control the release, but most of the time it's just going to do what you want without fuss anyway. We do get a choice of processing modes again, however. 0 latency mode is the same as dynamic phase in Pro MB, while linear phase mode is identical to the linear phase mode in MB, assuming you match the filter slopes in both. Note, however, that for low and mid frequencies, natural phase mode is identical to 0 latency, so in this context, it just means higher CPU and latency for no benefit at all. Next up, Volcano 3. This provides EQ-style filters as well, so a low shelf is no problem. We don't have the explicit dynamic EQ options from Pro Q3, but we do have some powerful modulation options. I'll load up an envelope generator and set that to key from the external sidechain with the kick drum routed as before. Let's have the sustain all the way up, then modulate the peak knob, which controls the gain for shelf filters, and set the modulation negative. There is no linear phase option here, so this is equivalent to dynamic phase mode in Pro MB. The threshold knob is now on the envelope generator, the range is set by the modulation depth, and the release can be controlled from the envelope generator again. We now have the interesting option to change the release curve. Reversing the curve direction can create more obvious pumping. Even more so if you add a tiny touch of hold as well. And of course you get all the different colour options from the different filter types, plus a drive knob to control how much they saturate. And finally we have Saturn. You probably know where this is going. We need to add a crossover to isolate the low frequencies. We need an envelope generator set up like before, with the kick drum driving the sidechain. We need to make sure that low band is selected, then modulate the level parameter and flip that negative. By default, we have a minimum phase crossover, so this is the same as minimum phase mode in Pro MB. Unless you switch to linear phase mode, which is the same as linear phase mode in Pro MB. Of course, whatever mode you choose, you get to also add some multiband saturation if you want. Here's a fun way to do dub-style delay throws for your snare drum. I've set up a cool-sounding delay. And I've set the feedback filters and the feedback knob so that it fades out relatively quickly after each throw. Now let's add an envelope generator. Make sure the threshold is catching the snares every time I throw them. And modulate the feedback knob. Let's have the sustain all the way up. And here's the important part, a large helping of hold time, as well as release to taste. Now each throw of the snare will bump up the feedback for however long that envelope holds at maximum. And your delays will threaten to spiral out of control before settling back down. And all you have to automate is the delay send. Let's talk about stereo compression. If I open up the bottom panel in Pro C2, I can control the stereo linking with this slider. Dragging it to the left will unlink the left and right channels and compress them independently, while dragging to the right will compress only the mid channel. We can change what happens to the right of this slider, however. Now we've got side channel compression only, which is quite different, really microdynamic control over stereo width. The tip I want to show you today is the mid to side option. This compresses the side channel, but with the mid channel driving the sidechain, which is its own thing entirely. I'm going to add to the fun by also low-pass filtering the sidechain, so the compression reacts mostly to the kick drum. This keeps those kick drums tight and dry and focused. But with some side channel only makeup gain, which is what you get when you turn on auto gain in this mode, all that stereo stuff can pump back up in between. It's a useful and underused trick, in my opinion. Notice there's also a side to mid compression option, so no doubt you'll be expecting me to provide a useful practical example for that. Yeah, I'll get back to you. Pro C2 is a very powerful compressor that can cover most compression duties, but one thing it can't do, at least not without using multiple instances and sidechain trickery, is overcompression, by which I mean ratios beyond limiting, more extreme than infinity to 1. But you can do that with Pro G. Choose the ducking mode, but don't switch to the external sidechain as you would for ducking. Stick with the internal sidechain, and the result is extreme overcompression. Notice how dramatically it changes this kick drum. You can see why this type of setting is unusual. Most of the time it just sounds bad. But it can work really well in parallel, like so. This adds a useful extra attack and definition to the kick drum. Of course, once it's running in parallel, it's not really overcompression anymore, as the effective ratio is reduced. But who cares if it works? Consider this a useful way to hype up the attack of things like kick drum and toms, or an interesting alternative to FET-style compression on drum room mics. Okay, last one. Sticking with Pro G. If you have MIDI enabled in the menu at the bottom left, you can open the gate using MIDI notes. The most obvious application might be transgate type effects, but it has much more prosaic uses as well. Consider this. I want to add a gated reverb to my snare drum. But I only want it on the backbeats. I don't want it muddying up all the ghost notes. And I also only want it to come in for the final big chorus of the song. Normally that would mean setting up the gate very carefully to exclude the ghost notes, while reliably opening on the main backbeat snare hits. And to make sure it opens for just the right time. And then automating the send or return to bring it in for just the required part of the song. Much easier to just control it all with MIDI notes and only paste those in for that last chorus. Okay, that's all. Thanks for watching. And here's to the next 20 years.